Tēnā koutou katoa. Look, it's my great privilege to introduce to you Rebecca Macfie, who's going to talk to us about her book, Helen Kelly, Her Life. This book has taken a bit of time to reach fruition and birth, and during that time I think I've got to know Rebecca much better. I did read her book on the Pike River Mine tragedy and was very impressed with the detail in the picture she painted about a group of workers who lost their life needlessly through the incompetence and neglect of a major company. Now, the impressive thing about Helen was that Helen gave speeches a number of times because she was very strong on winning the narrative, or winning the argument to actually bring us forward. And part of that narrative for people who have heard Helen speak was what she called the dominant narrative in our society. And that dominant narrative was that workers should be lucky they've got a job. A worker who stands up and demands more was biting the hand that fed them. And if they tried to organise, they would be condemned. Now, what I think that Rebecca has tackled in the book is Rebecca has given us the other side of that narrative, a side of the narrative which Helen herself repeated a number of times when she told us the stories of the forestry workers who lost their jobs, the Pike River miners who lost their jobs, workers throughout the country, farm workers who were getting paid less than the minimum wage. And I think it was this stories which was the real narrative. And it's these stories and the way that Rebecca has told it actually brings that social history to life. Now, rather than tell Rebecca's story, what really excites me about this book is the story won't just live with us who knew Helen, but the story will live through that book for our children, our grandchildren, future generations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rebecca and get her to talk about the book and what the story behind that book is.
Tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi nui kia koutou. Tēnā koe Isabel, e tau prohiri e me tau manakitanga. Tēnā koe e John, mō tō mihi. Tēnā koutou e komiti o Labour History Project, tā koutou mahi. Tēnā koutou, did I do something then? Tēnā koutou e ngā hoa mā e pōhiri ki au. Kia whakataumuri te haere whakamua. I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. It is an incredible honour and quite a nervous one really for me to be invited to speak to you tonight. Some audiences just feel harder than others somehow. I think it's because I have huge admiration for the work of this committee of the Labour History Project, and I'm very proud, somewhat belatedly, to be a member. And as I wrote that, I thought, God, have I paid my sub? I think I'm up to date. I might have to check with you later, Russell. And I know only a fraction of the work that's underway amongst the people who are in this room and who are part of this network. But one I can say that I'm really looking forward to is reading Sibel's book on Bill Anderson, which I know is coming out in a few months because I've been asked to review it. And I know it will be a huge contribution to New Zealand history. And I also want to thank the Labour History Project Committee for taking on the task of managing the fellowship that was set up to give me an income while I worked on the Helen Kelly book. For those of you who don't know, the CTU offered to raise funds for a fellowship for me, and that gave me the ability to leave my rather nice salaried job at the Listener to work full-time on the book. But because I insisted that I wouldn't do the book as a CTU commission and that I needed to be independent. And I didn't want to be beholden to anyone or to any organisation that contributed money. And in fact, I didn't even want to know who they were. So that created, not difficulties, but, it was a problem that had to be solved. And so thanks to the extremely wonderful Sue Windsor at the CTU and the Labour History Project Committee, things were set up so that the 70,000 that was raised, that was held in trust by the committee. And every few months, Russell would send me a lovely note telling me it was time for my next scheduled instalment. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou e, I te tātou āwhina. Thank you so much for the way that you supported me through the last 3 years. Not to mention also Sibel, who responded to a panicked email from me more or less at about 5 minutes before Christmas Eve last year when I realised I needed her permission to quote a couple of lines from the Trade Union Oral History Project interview with Angela Folks from 1998-9. Tēnā koe, Sibel. I stumbled into history when I was 18 and doing a BA at Otago, and then when I was 20 and asked to do honours. But that was the sum total of my academic life, aside from a postgrad diploma in journalism a few years later and a solitary paper in labour law. One of the people that influenced me a great deal was Michael Cullen, who was a brilliant teacher. One of his prescribed texts, which is still on my shelf, is E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. Another was John Omukupa, who taught the history of Southern Africa and the origins of apartheid. These men, and Dorothy Page on French history, Tom Brooking on Vogel and Balance and Mackenzie, taught me that history is about people and stories, and about power and how it's exercised, and about the evolution of ideas and how they come to dominate or to wither. They taught me that as we walk backwards to the future, we have to keep our eyes firmly fixed on the past. History is a discipline that has influenced me as a journalist, but I have spent more than half my life as a journalist, not an historian. And unfortunately, journalism in New Zealand anyway has tended to be dominated by the immediate and by the very proximate causes and effects of things. There's not a huge opportunity to reach deeply back into the big economic and social shifts and really analyse how and why they've brought us to the place we are, and what that might mean about where we're headed. I mean, you try your best as a journalist when you're writing about complex topics, but the reality is you just don't have the resources to spend a huge amount of time on that level of analysis. And you also tend to be quite strongly moderated by editors who think, and I think probably quite accurately, that readers don't really want to be dragged back into all that old stuff from way back then. They want to know about what's happening now and what's going to happen tomorrow. So consequently, when I came to start work on Helen Kelly's biography, it was about 38 years since I'd spent any time in an archive library. And because of the internet, I'd forgotten how to feed the spool onto the microfilm machine in the public library. And I hadn't actively really thought about the distinction between primary and secondary sources since I was about 21. And I'd forgotten how incredibly long you can spend grinding through files and papers, trying to imbibe the times and the material and just praying that today you're going to come across one of those specks of gold that you know are there and that they're going to help you tell the story. And to be honest, I also spent about the first year of work on this project completely freaked out by you lot. Because you're all proper scholars, and I'm not, and I was out of my depth and terrified that I would never meet the required standard. So, bearing in mind my non-scholarliness and my fundamentally journalistic approach, I thought that I'd talk to you a bit about how I arrived at the structure of the Helen Kelly biography and about where I found the most important material. Because I knew Helen for about 3 years before she died, and she had agreed to let me write a profile for her, for the Listener, which I was working for. I had enough basic insights into her story that the overall shape of the book was quite self-evident, really. Even aside from her leadership of the union movement, where there were so many strong elements to her story and the family story, that the structure was kind of straightforward. And basically that structure I put down about 5 months into the research was the structure that I stuck to right the way to the end. I also had a really strong sense that she could be a vehicle to look at two New Zealands, the pre-1984 New Zealand and the post-1984 New Zealand. I thought basically that her story was the story of our times, and I guess that I thought she would be okay with me treating it that way. All of the ingredients to do that were there, you see. There was Pat's story as a migrant from the world of poverty on the Liverpool docks, landing up on the big infrastructure projects of the 1950s, becoming a union activist and joining the Communist Party. There was Kath Eichelbaum as a child of wealth and a middle-class education, quite an extraordinary legal and Jewish whakapapa, who also joins the party, and is this very strong, daring, unconventional figure, not to mention a bit scary. And then their involvement in the great progressive battles of the 60s, 70s and 80s, pay equity, anti-Vietnam War, anti-apartheid, anti-nuclear, as well as all the frontline union work in the era of the ICNA system. And then their involvement in the heart of the Labour Party when it's torn apart in the 80s. So there's huge historical elements are there to work with. Too good to be true sometimes, it seemed. And then we have Helen coming into the movement just on the eve of the Employment Contracts Act, and for the next 20 years moving up through the movement to ultimately lead it, and trying to reassert these foundational ideas of dignity at work, decent pay, and a fair distribution of wealth against a dominant narrative that said if workers didn't earn enough to live on, or if they ended up dead by smoko time, it was probably their own fault. In any way, they ought to be grateful. So that was the meta story that I had. And at a personal level, at the level of the detail of the delivery of the story, it was pretty clear to me that I couldn't bring Helen's character to the page without knowing Pat and Kath pretty well too. And at times it felt like I was writing 3 biographies. But the material that really helped me with that were brilliant interviews that had been done by both Pat and Kath, by Anne Goodman and Pat Webster. And they just very generously gave me this material. You know, you can't believe how fortunate you are sometimes when people give you this sort of gift of resource. There was also a really long transcript of an interview that Leslie Hall had done with Kath as part of her research on communist women, which I found at the bottom of a box in the Kelly home in Shannon Street. And lots of other bits and pieces that people in the family remembered about or put me on to. There was an uncut original screen interview with Pat that had never been seen. Unpublished stories that Pat had written about his childhood, and boxes of personal correspondence up at Shannon Street. Another absolutely key resource were the files of the Service Workers Union held at the Turnbull. And these really allowed me to see what Pat was up to through those years when Helen was growing up and when he was running the Cleaners Union after 1976. And the voice he brought to that work, which I came to confidently conclude was also the voice of Shannon Street and the voice that Helen was immersed in. Because every month he would write these flaming reports for his executive about what the bosses were up to, where things had got to with the long campaign for pay improvement for school cleaners, and what was going on in the economy from the point of view of cleaners, about the wage freeze, about Kinleith, about the Springbok tour. These were just terrific reports. They were wonderful to read and just brilliant material. Getting an understanding of Pat and Kath's life within the Communist Party was a bit harder, but I was incredibly grateful to Peter Franks for putting me on to Ron Smith's memoir, which just gave me this very detailed history of the party through many of those years that Pat and Kath were involved, including when it all fell apart and they were cast out as part of the Manson, Bailey, Goddard, Kelly, Smith, Standen, Quinn, Austin, Harvey revisionist clique. Ron and others from the party also left files, kind of bitsy files at the Turnbull, which were just helpful to me in peering in a bit further into what it was like to be there, what the feel of this lost world was. I also did a lot of interviewing all the way through the research, right from the word go, about 200 people in all, and many of them, including the wonderful John Ryle, many times. And the interviewing was a really vital process for me. And it's maybe one of the things I guess it makes my work reportage rather than scholarship. Don't know, I'm not sure. But interviews for me are the place and the time where I really build insight and I build my confidence that I'm understanding things, that I'm getting a sense of the moment in time that I'm trying to understand, and also get corroboration or not from people who were around at the time that the picture I'm forming from other sources feels right, is right. And also, just about every time I met someone new from interview, they would point me in the direction of some more source material that I didn't know about or alert me to something that I'd overlooked. But, I mean, of course, this kind of interviewing is only possible if you're studying a very contemporary figure with huge numbers of people around who have an eyewitness experience of your topic. Not possible, obviously, if you're writing about somebody who's from a much earlier period in history. But for me, the document research and the interviewing for this project went along in a kind of a dual track all the way through. And it probably goes without saying I wouldn't have been able to write this book without the very full and generous cooperation of Helen's family, particularly Steve Hurring and Max Kelly, but also Helen's cousins and the wonderfully brilliant Bill Rosenberg. I'm embarrassing you, Bill. I didn't know you were going to be here when I wrote this, but you are. And there were just boxes and boxes of family archives at Shannon Street, you know, somewhat sorted, but, you know, a gigantic trove really. And Steve really lived with this stuff piled out all over the place for a long, long time. And he'd let me sit up there on the floor for days and just work my way through it. Among that material was Helen's teenage diaries. This was really difficult. I think it was important that I read them, but I really struggled with this. And it was actually one of the lowest points for me emotionally in the whole process. She was 4 years younger than me, and so the daily reality and pressures of her teenage years weren't a million miles from my own. Whether you smoke dope, whether your friends are smoking dope, getting dumped by boyfriends, heartbreak, school dances, alcohol, the bloody high school principal. And I related to it all as utterly normal. Although Helen was a far, far, far more well-adapted, productive and socially connected teenager than I ever was. But I think the thing that was really important for me to see was how ordinary she was. She was an ordinary girl. It also made me quite protective of her in those years. She didn't write down the daily details of her life at the age of 15, 16, 17 and 18, thinking that somebody was going to come along 40 years later reading it. So in the end, I just really absorbed a sense of her, who she was, as she developed into a young adult, what moved her and what troubled her or excited her, and the nature of her relationship with Pat and Kath, and what she thought about the world. Although I did pluck the odd golden line, like when she observes with quite impressive insight after the Tanya Harris march down Queen Street, quote, "Talk about bad news for the unions," she wrote in her diary. She was 16 in 1981 when that happened. Helen's first work was in 1989, her first, paid union work was in 1989 with the Early Childhood Workers Union and the Kindergarten Teachers Association, which became Secure later on as an emerger. That union left a brilliant archive of conference proceedings and minutes and correspondence, which, along with interviews with the leader of those unions at the time, allowed me to write the story through those years. And union journals, let them always continue to be published, because I found them an absolutely fantastic and vital source. Advance from the Cleaners, Double Take from Secure, Roro from NZEI, where Helen spent several years. In a project like this, there are also decision points and rabbit holes every day, right? Do I need to chase down that event? Do I go down that tangent? And if so, how far? For 2 sentences of context, how many days or week do I spend digging around trying to make sure I understand it properly? And one of the big decisions I needed to make was about how far to go in writing about how the Employment Contracts Act came to be the radical phenomenon that it was. I'd written about the ECA as a young Labour reporter working for the National Business Review in 1990-91. And I can remember quite vividly the shock when reading the bill when it was tabled on the 19th of December 1990, and how it went much further than what Bill Birch had been talking about when I'd been interviewing him multiple times over the previous year or two. So I'd always felt to some extent that I'd missed the story with the ECA. And I was pretty sure that there was more to be found out, especially about the exact role of the Business Roundtable. I mean, it was completely clear that they had played a huge role in terms of lobbying, but what exactly did that look like? What did it involve behind the scenes? I suppose I basically wanted to know if Roger Kerr had more or less written it. But I really had to decide if I could justify spending a whole lot of time trying to dig that out in a biography of Helen Kelly, who was just a junior union educator at that time. In the end, I decided I could justify it because ultimately the world that was created at that time was the world that Helen inherited as the leader of the movement. But anyway, it turned out that that part of the story was actually quite a bit easier than I thought it was going to be, because I wrote to Oliver Hartwich at the New Zealand Institute, which, as you know, is the offspring of the Round Table and the old New Zealand Institute, and asked him for access to the correspondence files of the CEO of the Business Round Table, which were held at the Turnbull. And he wrote me back a really lovely email saying yes, and could I please send him a copy of the book when it was published, because since he didn't really know much at all about all that stuff, he'd probably find it quite interesting. So Roger Kerr's files did tell the story of exactly how the Round Table had been intensively working on the National Front bench since 1987, and increasingly intensively on Birch, who exhibited what you could loosely call incorrect thought. And Bill caused Roger conniptions in various ways. For instance, Bill once said something not totally unfavourable about pay equity, and that maybe the Human Rights Commission could play a role as some kind of an arbiter. So Roger dropped a note to Doug E. Myers, suggesting, in effect, that a bit of education was required and could this please be seen to. Roger also arranged for Bill to be given a bit of schooling by Richard Epstein, a good friend of the Round Table from the US. And at one point, Roger gave Doug Myers his writing instructions as he went in to have a meeting with Bill. Doug was to, quote, stroke Bill, tell him to be a bit braver and bolder, let him know that this was his time in history. All of this was just brilliant organising, of course. As Barry Saunders put it in one of their PR strategy papers, they were, quote, creating a climate of opinion that enables government to make the right decisions. So Kerr's letters were full of these quite delicious details, and I was able to align what they revealed with what Ruth Richardson described in her memoir and in an interview I did with her. And I think you end up seeing that in those very few months, not even months, weeks really, between October 27th and December 19th, 1990, that Birch is really shoved far further than he would ever have got to under his own steam. So I was glad I did go out on this tangent, because I think it does cast a bit more light on how the ECA came to be the extremely radical piece of law that it was, and how its impact still shapes the world of work today. The CTU's archives obviously were really important sources, but the problem with documents is that they don't always tell you the truth. So a classic of this was the big bust up that happened towards the end of the 90s and the lead up to Ross Wilson and Paul Galter coming in. There'd been a big review done of the CTU by Nigel Hayworth, and if I'd believed the documents on the file, I would have thought that Nigel had concluded that everything was hunky-dory and also quite terrific. But the good thing about interviewing is that you find out when the documents have been sanitised, because if you talk to enough people, then sooner or later somebody's going to tell you. But some of the things that were really helpful on those files were things like Peter Harris's economic analyses of just how things were unfolding through the 90s from the union and workers' perspective. What was happening to Labour's share of the economy, how much workers were losing out, the kind of stuff that never really made it out into mainstream dialogue that was part of what was being snuffed out at that time. But also just the tone of the headline speeches and internal documents, for instance, around what later became the Employment Relations Act, that I think really began to feel like the words of an organisation that had lost its fire and was struggling to know how to stand and how to respond to the destruction caused by the ECA. By the time the story gets to Helen and the leadership of the CTU, a backbone of the research was the fact that I had access to her papers for the period of time that she was president, from 2007 to 15. There were some caveats around this, and I did have to get get permission for direct referencing. But this was an easy process, and it was not remotely limiting on what I wrote or how. And I really have to take my hat off to Richard Wagstaff at the CTU for his openness and attitude to this. For instance, the fact that I had access to Helen's complete frustration with the meat workers union and that she commissioned an entire review, whether they liked it or not, was something I might not have known about if not for that access. And that story is really quite important insight into her approach, because it was typical of how she stomped around on other unions' toes all the time in order to try and get the kind of reform and progress in the movement that she wanted. Similarly, the complete blowout between her and Ray Bianchi at the Amalgamated Workers Union over the fact that she went into bat for Charanpreet Dhaliwal, the young non-union student who was murdered on his first night working as a security guard on a West Auckland building site. The unexpurgated papers that I had meant that I was able to see how that showdown with Ray built up without having to completely rely on other people's memories was really important. Overall, I think the real beauty of the fact that I had this access to her papers, allowing for the need to protect people's privacy, was that I was able to see how she was developing as a thinker and a person. And then I could see exactly how she related to people who came to her, how she worked with the likes of the forestry families, really connecting with them on an incredibly personal level, deeply human level, mother to mother in many cases, sister to sister. No matter how many interviews I did with people who said that Helen was tough and brave and loyal and, if necessary, ruthless, having documentary verification of that person meant I could get to know her on my own terms, firsthand. Yesterday I was asked to talk to the CTU Women's Conference, and I said to them, Helen didn't save the union movement or fix workers' problems, but she was a singular leader, an authentic and powerful leader. And I think she went a long way to restoring the voice of the union movement after a generation in which it had been systematically and very successfully cast as a mere self-interested lobby group, an interloper in the world of work, in which it had been cast as external to the interests of workers, as other. I think by proving through cases like Charanpreet, Charles Finlay, Ieremiha Pairama, and many others that the union movement must stand with all workers, but especially the low-paid and the vulnerable who face those huge physical and psychological risks every day, I think she reasserted the values of justice, fair pay, decency, a fair share, and honourable relationships at work. She knew she had to tell a new story of work to challenge the dominant narrative, and she did. Thank you again for allowing me the honour of speaking to you. I have discovered a whole lot of new heroes in the course of writing this book, and you are among them, for continuing to document the stories of working people and the labour movement, which we all know are stories that would otherwise go untold. Tēnā koutou katoa.